There is a discussion among the Mefarshim on what was the status of the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Kodem Matan Torah, before the Torah was given. As we all know, the Torah was given on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai, and that's why we're obligated in commandments. Even though Avram, let's say, did the mitzvah of Milah, and the Avos did other mitzvahs, the reason why I'm obligated to do Milah has nothing to do with Abraham. The reason why it's binding, once it has nothing to do with Abraham, historically speaking, and we learn out different qualities of Abraham in terms of how he performed the mitzvahs, but the Rambam writes in Perish HaMishnayos, in Chul and in other places, the reason why it's binding on me, perhaps I could volunteer, maybe not, because then I get into a problem of injuring my body if there's no commandment. But the reason why I'm obligated to do Milah is because it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. And that's when we received a full Kedushas Yisrael. We make the bracha, Asher Kitevs of et Sivanu, because we didn't get all the mitzvahs until Har Sinai, and that's where we have a full-fledged Kedusha sanctity of the Jewish people. There's a discussion, the Mishnah Lamelech, one of the commentaries on the Rambam, is one of the first to discuss. It's a discussion in the Rishonim as well. What was the status of the Avos before? Did they have the status of Ben Noach? That was the status of everyone. We know there are 7 universal laws. And these are the big 3. The 3 things you have to give up your life for. Not commit adultery, idol worship, or murder. And then Aleph is Aver Min Achai. You can't eat a limb from a live animal. Beis is a euphemism, Birkas Hashem, meaning you can't curse God. Gimel is Gezel, stealing. And Dalet is Dinim, setting up a court system. So we know there were 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach. So the question, what the Avos had a status of B'nai Noach, or they have a status of a Yisrael. So that's a discussion, and and perhaps they were somewhere in between, as Rav Soloveitchik points out, that the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach were given to the whole world. And in fact, there's some books put out. There's some people today who claim to keep the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach. A lot of Jews who claim to keep that, but a lot of non-Jews who keep the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and different people wrote different books on it, etc. But Rav Soloveitchik explained, since the Kedushas Yisrael, the sanctity of the Jewish people was based on the mitzvahs, so he claims like they had a quasi status, like it was in between a full Kedushas Yisrael and 7 mitzvahs, because as the Rambam writes, that each of the Avos kept on adding more mitzvahs. That's why Abraham Avinu, in addition to the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach, he instituted the mitzvah of Milah. And in fact, that's why it says in Tehillah, Ma'anatzeach ala Shminis, is referring to Bris Milah, which is the 8th, besides Bris Milah being done on the 8th day, but Bris Milah was the 8th mitzvah given to after the first 7 mitzvahs. So they were probably somewhere in between status. And in fact, we find in Chazal, they even have this concept of the Avos keeping the Torah before it was given. We find that in many different sayings in Chazal. In fact, they ask questions, how could it be done? This is against the Torah, even though the Torah in theory wasn't given until Har Sinai. Of course, we all know, the Chazal tell us the Torah was given even before the world was created. It was given, God looked at the Torah and created the world. And that's why, that's the famous Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon points out, we know the last eight psukim in the Torah is a discussion who wrote them. Was it Moshe or was it Yehoshua? Why would we have a discussion on the last 8 psukim? Why not the first 8 psukim? Isn't that heresy? Even entertaining a discussion that perhaps Moses did not write the whole Torah. So the last 8 psukim is talking about the obituary of Moshe Rabbeinu. So how does it look? Vayamasha Moshe. So it's a discussion whether he wrote the last 8 psukim or not. We gave a whole share on it, but 2 opinions whether Yoshua wrote it or Moshe wrote it. Even if Moshe wrote it, Moshe Kosei B'dema, Moshe wrote it differently than the rest of the Torah. So the question, one of the Rabbi Yehuda asked Rav Shimon, how could you say Moshe wrote it, Michzei Keshikra? It looks like a falsehood. It looks like a lie. How could How can Moshe be talking about his death while he's still alive? So the Vilna Gaon says, like, what do you mean? You could ask that question on the whole Torah. Lech lecha, vayera Hashem chayei Sarah. The Torah was written well before the world was created. So what do you mean, Mechse Keshikra? So the Vilna Gaon has a whole explanation about, based on the Ramban, Nechmanides, in the beginning of Bereshis, that there's the pristine Torah into the original form, and the one that God gave to Moses at Har Sinai. In other words, the original Torah was Shmosav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was all names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you could decipher the code, you'd be able to figure out what it's saying. But we wouldn't be able to read anything. And then at Har Sinai, God deciphered the code to Moses. Okay, this is how you put the letters together. It's Bereshis, Baruchim, it's a Torah that we could give. So that's what the Vilna Gaon explain. Moses wrote the last 8 psukim in the pristine state. So he wasn't writing Vayam Hashem Moshe. He didn't write about his own death because that's not what he didn't understand that. It was in the pristine. And later on, Yoshua came along, and finished it. So Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. But either way, there's a discussion about the Avos keeping the whole Torah. In fact, as we go through all the parshas, how did Yaakov have two wives? How could he marry 2 sisters? We find questions in the Mefarshim implying that they understood that the Avos kept the Torah. In fact, it's not even implied. The Gemara in Yuma and Daf Chavches says it explicitly, and many other Gemaras. The Gemara says Avram Avinu fulfilled the whole Torah even before it was given. And the Gemara even says Afilu Erev Tavshilin. Even the mitzvah of Erev, which we're all familiar with since this Yom Tov, we had a lot of Thursday, Friday Yom Tovim. This year we're going to have them next year also. Erev Tavshilim is the mitzvah you prepare on Yom Tov so you'll have enough food for Shabbos. So why is Erev Tavshilim an example of Avram? So simple pshat is that he even kept the rabbinic laws. That's how meticulous Abraham was. He was able to intuit even not only the biblical laws, but the rabbinic laws. But others point out, no, Erev Tavshilim has to do with feeding guests. What was the essence of Avram Avinu? The Midas HaChesed, that his life was Haknas Tzarcha, and that's why the Gemara gives that example. Whatever the example is, the assumption is Avram kept Kol HaTorah Kulo even before it was given. And in fact, that's why it's the famous question is, when it came to the mitzvah of bris milah, of circumcision, why did Avram wait? By all other commandments, we say Avram volunteered it. So how come when it comes to the mitzvah of bris milah, Avram waited for a tzivah, a commandment? So on that there are a couple of answers. One is, some explain, because by definition, what's a bris? A covenant. What's a peace treaty? We all know it has to involve 2 people, 2 sides to make it meaningful. So what was Avram going to make a bris with himself? Obviously there was no one else there yet, so he had to wait until he was commanded in the midst of bris in order to have one. A bris involves 2 parties. There's a famous answer of the Vilna Gaon and the Marami Diskin, who points out that based on the Gemara in Kiddushin, that we have a principle of Gado HaMetzuva V'Yoseh Mishe'eno Metzuva V'Yoseh. Greater is the one who does a mitzvah who's commanded than one who volunteers. And of course, even though on a certain level, volunteering is a higher level, we prefer the kids to take out our garbage before we tell them to take it out. But as Tosfos points out in Kiddushin, that's not what the Gemara is focusing on. It's much harder to do something when you have to do it. When someone's over you, commanding you to do something, the Yetzer Hara, it's much more difficult to do it. And it's human nature not to be like to told what to do. As we all know, as when you have kids, as in something called reverse psychology, you tell them the opposite of what you want because you want them to listen. Of course, the question is, it's a mitzvah of chinuch, of teaching your kids to listen to your parents. So at what age you stop doing reverse psychology, I'll leave that to you. But the human nature is that you have to, you don't like being told what to do. So therefore...
I think about 30.
You must instruct them not to listen to you.
That young at 30?
So I'm just hoping.
Listen, until that kid, don't listen to me now.
So they point out that Gado HaMetzuva V'Yoseh, so therefore Avram waited to be commanded because he wanted to get the greater schar of Gadol HaMatzuvah. So the question is, so what about all the other ones? All the other mitzvahs he volunteered on his own without a commandment. So why is Milah different? That's what the Vilna Gaon explains, because by putting on tefillin today, it doesn't stop me from putting it on tomorrow, the next day. Keeping Shabbos this week doesn't stop me from keeping it next week. You could do it as many times as you want. Milah is a one-time shot. So you want to do it, make sure you do it right. So therefore, he wanted to do Milah, what Besiva, and that's how some explain. It's a very strange Rashi in this week's parsha. The Torah says, Be'elonei Mamre. The God appeared to himself in the fields of Mamre. So Rashi writes, what's Mamre got to do with anything? He gave an Eitzah al HaMilah. He gave him advice on doing the Milah. 20 different answers to that question, but the one we want right now is, what do you mean Eitzah? Avram needed, God told you to do something, you can ask Mamre? So some explain that because, as the Gemara also tells us in Yevamos, that the mitzvah of Milah of Avram was different than our mitzvah. That's the biggest proof that we don't do the mitzvah because of Avram. Avram only was commanded a Milah. We have three parts. We have Milah, that's cutting off the foreskin, Priya, revealing the membrane, and then we have Mitzitza, sucking out the blood, Tue May. So Avram Avinu was only commanded a Milah, not Priya. And that's what he was discussing with Mamre. And it says Avram himself did the Priya. So he was discussing with Mamre, God only commanded me in Milah, but I want to keep all the Torahs. He was wrestling with that issue, whether he should do a Milah or Priya. But either way, that's why, but even though Avram usually volunteered, but that was the other mitzvah. Milah was a one-time shot, and therefore he had to wait to be commanded. And others point out this pragmatically because we know there's a biblical prohibition of causing damage, causing harm to oneself. In fact, probably one of the biggest mitzvahs the Jews have been accused of being barbaric and taking abuse in history has been the mitzvah of Milah. How could you do it to an 8-year-old baby? You're so barbaric, you're causing him a wound. And throughout Jewish history, that's always been a sore point in terms of whether, people go back and forth, whether it's healthy and not healthy, but you always have that. So before the mitzvah of Milah, it'd be prohibited to do a Milah, because you're not going to cause a wound to yourself. It was only once you have the mitzvah of Milah, then you have a command. So Avram, it's not something you could volunteer. Even a Ben Noach is prohibited of being chovel, of damaging themselves, and therefore that's why Avram couldn't volunteer it. By other mitzvahs, there's no harm. But here, he's violating a biblical prohibition of causing harm to oneself. It's only because of the mitzvah of Milah that he was able to do it. And then there's the famous answer of the Brisker Rav that he points out that it was only, in other words, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, the mitzvah of Milah, or there's something called an aral? That used to be the big curse word during those days. You were called uncircumcised. So there's someone physically uncircumcised, but the Brisker Rav points out that the status of aral did not exist until the mitzvah of Milah existed. It only is the mitzvah of Milah that created the status of an aral. So before, even though he was physically uncircumcised, there's nothing wrong with that. It only became a problem. That's why the Meshech Chachma points out, it fits in very well to the Psukim. It says, right after God appeared to Avram, and he told him about the mitzvah of Milah, the next pasuk is, Vayipol al panav. Avram went down on the ground, and Rashi writes, because he felt incomplete. He didn't do the mitzvah of Milah. But the obvious question is, Avram spoke to God many times before that. He didn't feel incomplete before then. Why didn't he go on? The answer was, he was never commanded a Milah before, so therefore it wasn't an issue. It's only the mitzvah of Milah that created the status of, and in fact, that's the Rabbeinu Tam in the Gemara in Yevamos, that we all know there's a case that we have a mitzvah of doing Milah. However, Meisu Achav Machmas Milah, let's say you had two sons and you did a Milah and they died, they're hemophilic because they couldn't stop the bleeding. There's a lachis on the third one, you don't do a Milah unless maybe later on if he gets healthy, but you don't do a Milah because Meisu Achbok Machmas Milah, you're not allowed to do it, it's a danger. So the Gemara talks about, let's say, a Kohen who is an Aral can't eat Truma. You have to be, so the question is, what about this child? Is he able to eat Truma? Well, why not? Well, he's an Aro. Well, that's the most assume he can't. But Rabbi Aaron has a chiddush. He says he's allowed to eat the truma. Why? Because he has no mitzvah of milah. It's the mitzvah of milah that creates the status of an Aro, and therefore others don't disagree. They just claim, no, this person is chayav of milah. He can't do it. That you're chayav, but you're an honest. That's different. And that's the way they assume. But Rabbi Aaron has a chiddush that it's the mitzvah of milah, and he's not obligated. And in fact, it really comes from a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi talks about, could you stach a child shemen shel truma, that a child could you oil shel truma. So the Yerushalmi writes the first 7 days you can, day 8 you can't. Because why? Because day 8 now he became chayav of milah, so therefore he has the status of an aro, and therefore you can't use shemen shel truma. The Yerushalmi's issue is what about the night? Leil Shmini, could you stach shemen shel truma? What's the issue of the 8th night? Because you know the mitzvah begins on day 8, but the day begins at night, but you can't do a milah at night. So that's the mitzvah of the Yerushalmi. When does the mitzvah of milah begin? Does the chiyuv begin at night, except I can't do it till the next morning? Or no, the chiyuv doesn't begin. That's the issue. So just to summarize, we're discussing the status of the Avos Kodem Matan Torah, and it's a major discussion that they have the status of Bnei Noach or Yisrael, and Avram probably somewhere in between. The Avos instituted new mitzvahs, and we do all the mitzvahs because Moshe Rabbeinu, not because of the Avos, and that's why even the mitzvah of milah was different. They only had milah, not priya. And we asked, how could Avram Avinu, why did he wait for milah to be commanded? He volunteered all the mitzvahs, either because a bris only makes sense with 2 people. It was us of him to do it because you can't damage your body. Whether like the Gra, milah is a one-time shot, so you have to wait and do it right. Or like the Brisker Rav writes, because he didn't have the status of an Oro until the mitzvah of milah. We'll discuss tonight a topic that is relevant to the whole Sefer Bereshis, the whole book of Bereshis, and it deals with the question of the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, keeping the Torah. Did they actually keep the Torah? Did they keep some of the Torah? What are some principles in helping us understand? Because Chazal, our rabbis, tell us that Avram Avinu, the Gemara in Yuma, Daf Chavches, that Avram Avinu kept the Torah even before it was given. He kept the whole Torah. Afilu Eruvev Tavshilin, even the mitzvah of Erev Tavshilin, which is a rabbinical mitzvahs, and specifically Erev Tavshilin has to do with preparing food for guests on Yom Tov Shabbos. So Avram represents Hachnasas Archim, entertaining guests. But on one hand we find the Avraham, the Avos, keeping the whole Torah. On the other hand, we find different things that happen that seem to show that the Avos did not keep the whole Torah. Like Yaakov marrying 2 wives, Yitzchak eating nevela, and then the many different chazals. We'll go through some of them as we go through the principles. But what exactly is the principle? How do we qualify it? What mitzvahs did they keep? What did they keep? What is the principle at hand? So we'll discuss 4 different opinions in the Mefarshim, in the commentators tonight. Number 1 is the Tshuvas HaRamah. The Ramah, Ramosha Isserles, who wrote Shulchan Aruch for the Ashkenaz. He comments on the Machaber of Yosef Cairo. So he wants to explain that it's no difficulty. The Gemara says in Yuma, as I mentioned, Avram kept the whole Torah, but it doesn't say Yitzchak and Yaakov, and therefore the Ramah is of the opinion that only Avraham kept the whole Torah before it was given. Yitzchak and Yaakov did not keep the whole Torah, and all the different medrashim you find by Yitzchak and Yaakov. So, logically one perhaps could make that argument that only Abraham took it on and not Yitzchak and Yaakov, but it's difficult based on the different chazals, because as we know, with the famous Rashi quoting chazal by Yaakov, Im Lavan Garti, the Taryag mitzvah shamarti. So they kept the Taryag mitzvahs. It's Yaakov. So it's difficult to say that it only applied to Avraham. But that's what the Chuvas Rama writes, that this principle only applies to Avraham and not to Yitzchak and Yaakov. However, the next three explanations will say no, it applies to all the Avos. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then we have to understand how come then we find certain times the Avos seem to be going against what it says in the Torah. So the second approach is the Ramban will share. The Ramban, he's bothered by, well, how is it that Yaakov married two sisters? We know there's a prohibition in the Torah to marry two sisters. So how could Yaakov marry Rachel and Leah? So the famous answer of the Ramban is that the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, only kept the Torah in Eretz Yisrael. They only volunteered the Torah in the land of Israel. But outside the land of Israel, they never accepted upon themselves the Torah. And in fact, that's how some explain, that's why Rachel died on the derech. Rachel died on the way back before Yaakov made it back to Eretz Yisrael, because he couldn't go back into Eretz Yisrael with two wives, with marrying two sisters. So therefore, that's why Rachel died. And this is Ramban seems to be consistent with his view. So the Ramban seems to say Eretz Yisrael, which is the ultimate. We could have the Beis HaMikdash and everything, and that's, we have many special mitzvahs we have in Eretz Yisrael. We don't have the mitzvahs atuliyas ba'aretz, the special agricultural mitzvahs we have in Eretz Yisrael. We don't have in other places. The Beis HaMikdash will be there. Eretz Yisrael is the purpose for the mitzvahs, and therefore the others only kept them in Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban is famous for Shita on the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah chiyuvis. It's a mandatory obligation, the Ramban writes. Everyone is obligated to live in Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam, Maimonides, is silent on the issue, and that is a whole list of commentators from the fact, why did the Rambam omit it? Either because he didn't feel it was a mitzvah, or maybe it's a rabbinical mitzvah, or perhaps it's even a biblical mitzvah, but the Rambam counted it in other mitzvahs, like the Avdei Nezer writes that the Rambam gives us a principle that certain times there are more than 613 mitzvahs, but I'm only going to count one of them. So for instance, the Avdei Nezer writes, there's a mitzvah to conquer the land of Israel and throw out the 7 nations. So that's a mitzvah in the Torah. So what's the mitzvah? To throw out the 7 nations and move back to New York, California, Toronto? No, obviously the mitzvah is to live there. So the Avdei Nezer writes, the Rambam already counts the mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. He just doesn't say it directly. He counts it. It's included in that mitzvah. Because why else do you have to throw people out? So obviously it must mean to move in. So within the Rambam you have many different interpretations, but the Ramban is clear. There's a biblical obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael. He says halacha. But even in terms of hashkafa, we find the Ramban having very strong words about Eretz Yisrael. Like we have the Gemara at the end of Ksubis, which talks about the praises of the land of Israel. So the Ramban writes, like different chazals, whoever lives in Chutz La'aretz, whoever lives outside the land of Israel, it's like you're an idol worshiper. Many strong chazals in favor of living in Eretz Yisrael. So the Ramban writes that certainly the mitzvahs hatuliyas ba'aretz only apply in Eretz Yisrael. Only the mitzvahs that are dependent on the land, of course, it only applies in Eretz Yisrael. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe was mitzvah. Moshe had difficulty. He wanted to know. He wanted to be able to fulfill the mitzvahs hatuliyas ba'aretz. The mitzvahs are dependent on living in the land of Israel, and therefore you wanted to go in. But so certainly those mitzvahs only apply in Israel. But the Ramban seems to say even tefillin and mezuzahs, even the Chovet HaGuf, even all those mitzvahs, the whole purpose is to do them in the land of Israel. And the reason why we do it in Chutz La'aretz, the reason why we do it outside the land of Israel, because we're going to be in Golas, we're going to be outside the land of Israel for a long time. So not to forget how to do the mitzvahs properly, so therefore we do it in Chutz La'aretz. But the main purpose of all the mitzvahs is to do them in Eretz Yisrael. Contrary to certain sects that basically said that now that we're in Eretz Yisrael, we don't have to keep the mitzvahs anymore. Because now the mitzvahs is to work the land, to do other things. Who has to keep mitzvahs? The purpose of keeping mitzvahs, you need to do it in Chutz La'aretz, so you don't intermarry, assimilate. The opposite of what the Ramban says. The Ramban says the purpose of the mitzvahs is to fulfill in Eretz Yisrael. So others, the Vilna Gaon, can't believe this Ramban in terms like, how could it be? Is it possible that the purpose of tefillin and mezuzahs are only in Eretz Yisrael? The mitzvah applies all wherever you live. In fact, it bothered the Vilna Gaon so much, he felt it was a mistake because it said Taf Vav Mem, so he says the author wrote tefillin and mezuzahs, but he should have written Trumas Umaisris, which are agricultural mitzvahs. And the Rav discussed this. The Rav also wasn't crazy about this Ramban either. Rav Kook, and Rav Shakto, like saying over that Rav Kook made a big deal out of this Ramban, and Rav Soloveitchik wasn't crazy about it. He seemed to go with the Vilna Gaon. He basically couldn't believe that the mitzvahs of Tefillah and mezuzahs are limited to, we don't pass like this Ramban, but it seems to be that's what the Ramban says, because Rashi quotes this Ramban, so even though the Vilna Gaon says it's a mistake, but whatever it is, we don't pass like it, but the concept the Ramban has, the Ramban says, so it fits into what the Ramban is saying here. If the Ramban holds the whole purpose of all the mitzvahs is to keep them in Eretz Yisrael, so the Avos knew that. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov knew that, and therefore, when they intuited it, through Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, so they only accepted it to keep the mitzvahs in the land of Israel. But in Chutz La'aretz, they didn't. That's why, that's how the Ramban explains, when we find the Avos violating the Torah, it must be they were in Chutz La'aretz. Because in Eretz Yisrael, that's where they accepted, and that's how he explained Yaakov marrying two sisters. So that's the explanation of the Ramban. So we have the Truas HaRamah, that only Avram kept the Torah, and not Yitzchak and Yaakov. But we have the Ramban that says, no, all the Avos kept it, but they only kept it in the land of Israel, and not outside the land of Israel. The third answer is from Rav Chaim Volozhin, the Nefesh HaChaim, the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, and others. They want to point that as follows, that even though the Avos kept Kol HaTorah Kulo, which they did, however, as we know, is the Torah's Eino Mitzuva Va'oseh. It was voluntary. Even when they kept the commandment, it wasn't because they had to do them. Perhaps we'll see they had to do the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 6 mitzvahs that were given to Adam, and then the 7th mitzvah, in which Eber Menachai, which is given to Noach, because that's when animals became permitted, and it's called Noach because there's always Hashem Sofo. Since Noach finished them, they're called the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach, but really, strictly speaking, 6 were given to Adam. Now, and the 7 are, by the way, the 7 universal laws. I remember by the big 3, the 3 things one has to give up their life for: not to commit adultery, not to worship idols, not to murder someone. If someone puts a gun to you and says you murder someone or I'll kill you, you have to be willing to die. And then Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, Eber Menachai, for Aleph, tearing a limb off a live animal, Beis, a euphemism, Birkas Hashem, blessing, which means you can't curse God, Gezel, stealing, kidnapping, and Dalet, Dinam, setting up a court system. So really, so we know the Shavah mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the Avos, minimally were obligated in keeping. But the other mitzvahs, they did it voluntary. Like we have a concept of mitzvahs aseh shazman groma, a time-oriented mitzvah, like the Mishnah tells us in Kedushin. Women are exempt from time-oriented commandments. However, in most cases, there's a question about a woman volunteering putting on a talis, a tefillin. Those are more problematic or questionable, but in terms of sitting in a sukkah, hearing the shofar, shaking the lulav, those are praiseworthy. And even for B'nai Ashkenaz, they even can make a blessing on it. Even though they're exempt, it's praiseworthy to volunteer even with a bracha. So we have this concept in general, you can do things when you're not commanded. However, we know Gadol hametzuva v'yosem m'she'eino metzuva. Greater is the one who is commanded, the one who is not, as the Gemara says, because it's much harder to do something when you have to do it. That's how they explain why Abraham waited to be commanded on the bris milah, because you only can do the mitzvah milah once, so he wanted to get a greater reward after he was obligated. But the other mitzvahs, he could put on tefillin today, tomorrow, the next day. You could shake lulav this sukkah, next sukkah. Other mitzvahs you could do all the time, so by doing it doesn't interfere when you become obligated, or if you become obligated. But milah is a one-time shot. So we see, besides the fact that it's a greater reward because it's harder to do, but there's also less flexibility. Someone who could just volunteer, a woman who's exempt from sitting in the sukkah, it's up to her. It's recommended and it's praiseworthy she does, but if she doesn't, it's her option. So therefore, if she has other things to do, or she can't make it, so then she doesn't have to eat in the sukkah. She's exempt from the sukkah, even eating bread. However, a man doesn't have that luxury. The man is obligated, so besides it being more difficult to do because you're commanded, no one likes to be told what to do. In addition, you don't have flexibility. Obviously I have to do this mitzvah, God said it. I can't stop making, obviously if you have a question, you speak to a posek, and then maybe there are ways out to circumvent it. But as a general rule, you have a mitzvah to do, you have to do it. And therefore you have less flexibility if I'm commanded in something than if I volunteer. If it's your day off and you feel like coming in, so you can do what you want. If you're working today, you have less flexibility. You have to do your job. So the Nefesh HaChayim, Rav Chaim Volozhin, explains that the Avos kept the Torah as a Edo Mitzvah, someone who wasn't commanded. In fact, that's why we have this concept of Aveira L'Shema, a very difficult concept, that sometimes you can do an Aveira, a sin, for the sake of the cause, and in the end up, it's going to cause more good than harm. So that's certainly applied before the Torah was given, and it's a much bigger issue after the Torah was given. That's a discussion how we apply it. But before the Torah, you have more flexibility because the Torah wasn't given yet, so obviously you had the concept of Aveira L'Shema. So the Chaim Volozhin explains that the Avos figured out through divine inspiration all the mitzvahs and when you do a mitzvah, it has a tremendous impact in heaven. And the Hasidic Svarim, they point out, you create angels, so to speak. When you do good deeds, good angels, bad deeds, bad angels, but it has an effect in Shamayim. So he says, by the Avos, they had the flexibility. They realized that ultimately they don't have to do it, but they're doing it because through divine inspiration they realized the right thing to do. So 95% of the cases they know they just followed what the Torah said. But in 5% of the cases, 7%, 10%, whatever the percent is, they realize that in heaven, in this scenario, I'm better off not doing the mitzvah. Like Yaakov realized that he had to marry these two wives. If it was Achama and Torah, if the Torah was given and the Torah said you can't marry two sisters, he can think all he wants, he can't do it. That's the halacha. However, Kodama and Torah, before the Torah was given, so it was just he only volunteered it, and it was Ruach HaKodesh. So he saw the Ruach HaKodesh that it was better off, the result would be greater, in this case, to marry two sisters than not. So that's how, and in fact, that's how the Brisker out explains in Parashas Toldos. He explains, but we know the difficult pregnancy that Rivka had. And then she says, Lama zeh anochi, who needs this? As Rashi writes, what do I need to all this pain of childbirth and everything? So the Brisker Rav is a different pshat based on what we're saying today. But it's based on this Rav Chaim Elazhin and Or Chaim, that he quotes the Gemara in Brachas, which tells us a famous story between Yeshaya HaNavi and Chizkiyahu HaMelech. So Chizkiyahu HaMelech was on his deathbed. So Yeshayahu came to visit him. He said, you're not going to live in this world, in the next world. He said, why, what did I do wrong? So Yeshaya Navi said to him, you didn't fulfill your mitzvah, of being fruitful and multiply and having children. He says, I'll tell you why. I have a good reason why I didn't. Because I saw through divine inspiration that I'm going to have wicked children, wicked descendants are coming out of me, and therefore I realized it was better not to have kids. So Yeshaya Navi said, Bahadi, quoting the Gemara, that the secret of the world leave to God. That's none of your concern. God commanded you in the midst of having kids. It's not for you to start making accounting, should I, shouldn't I? You have an obligation to have them. Let God take care of the problem. So and he said, you're going to die because of this. So he said, was there any? So give me your daughter, he says, Yeshua, that maybe now my merit and her merit will be able to be saved. And he said, it's too late. She can't be saved. And his God said, no, of course I can be saved. We have a tradition. Even if the knife is on your throat, the knife is in your heart, but call ha-mechuber l'chayim yesh bita. As long as you're alive, there's always hope for tshuva. So either way, so as the story goes on, but the point being is, Yeshaya HaNavi rebuked Chizkiyahu HaMelech for not having kids, even though Chizkiyahu realized he's going to have wicked kids. So the Brisker Rav points out, and others, that the logic of Chizkiyahu HaMelech was there. What he said was very logical. Why should I bring in wicked kids into the world? What's not so... What was the problem? Is you're commanded. So it's not your job to start making cheshbonos whether you should or shouldn't. However, if I'm not commanded, then I can't make cheshbonos. So that's the pshat. Rivka, lama zeh anochi. The Mishnah tells us in Yavamos, the way we paskin, a woman is exempt from the mitzvah of pru revu. As erotic as it sounds, she's the one having the child. That's a separate shir on why a woman is exempt from the mitzvah of pru revu, because of the pain of childbirth, etc. We can check out the Meshech Chochmah another time, or we spoke about it before. But a woman, whatever the issues are, a woman is exempt. Pru revu v'kivshuha. The pasuk says, and you shall conquer the world. That's men. The men fight in the army, and therefore they learn out the purpose is to populate the world, and therefore women are exempt. So that's a Rivka thing. Lama zeh anochi. By Yitzroto Abana Mekir, I know, I found out there's going to be an Esav and a Yaakov. Lama zeh anochi, I don't need this. If I'm having Esav, I don't want him, maybe I shouldn't have the kids. And we see even though she was having a Yaakov, and similarly with Yeshaya HaNavi, so it seemed there was Chizkiyahu HaMelech, he was going to have good descendants also, but he figured the bad descendants outweigh them. And that's what Rivka is saying, Lama zeh anochi, who needs this? I'm having a schizophrenic, and the answer is no. Shnei Goyim Avidnak. Don't worry, it's two different kids. Don't worry, it's Esav who's trying to jump out to the house of idol worship, and it's Jacob jumping out to the yeshiva to learn. So they point out that that's the cheshbon. Lama zeh anochi, I'm not obligated in pru revu, so therefore I have a right to make cheshbon. It's Lama zeh anochi. But that's what the Rav Chaim Elazhin explains, and others, that's how many cases, let's say in the case of how could Yaakov marry two sisters, or in other areas, they look at the big picture, they have a right to look at the big picture. We always look at the big picture, but they have a right to look at the big picture and decide whether they should keep this mitzvah or not, since they're only volunteering it. But if we were obligated in the commandments, you can't. So that's how they explain, that's how Yaakov married two wives and other things, because they saw in heaven, in those specific cases, better to violate the Avera, the sin, than to keep it, but it's a greater gain than loss. So that's how, that's the Orach Chayim and Nefesh HaChayim. A fourth explanation is the Maharal MiPrague. The Maharal MiPrague, he suggests another distinction. We know we have different distinctions in commandments. We have commandments ben Adam lamakom, commandments ben Adam lechavero. We have commandments between man and God and man and man. It's one. And the other distinctions we have mitzvahs aseh and mitzvahs lo aseh. Positive commandments and negative. 248 positive, 365 negative. So the Maharal wants to suggest that maybe the Avos only kept the mitzvahs aseh, the positive commandments. They did not keep the negative commandments. In other words, we know we have a principle, as the Ramban writes in Parashas Yisro. We know we have a principle in the Gemara, aseh docha los aseh. A positive mitzvah sometimes supersedes a negative commandment. So, for instance, that you're allowed to put wool and linen on the tzitzis because in order to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis, or on the big day kahuna, or on the priest's garment. So what's the logic? Why do we say aseh, a positive commandment is greater than a negative commandment? So they point out because aseh signifies ava, love, and a los aseh signifies fear of God. And we know gadol ava. Ava is a greater level than yira. Serving God out of love is a much higher level than serving God out of fear. That's how the Arizal, some say Pshat, Yom Kippur, Kippurim. Yom Kippur is like Purim. In other words, Purim is greater because Purim is the day of Ava. While Yom Kippur is the day of Yira, you're in shul all day saying Al-Chay and asking for forgiveness. So we see aseh have inherent value. You're showing your love, and the mitzvahs themselves are inherently value, but not fulfilling a negative commandment shows you fear of God. But that only makes sense when you're commanded. I'm only refraining from eating at McDonald's because the Torah says I can't eat non-kosher. But if there was no prohibition of non-kosher, if I'm refraining from eating from certain food, like I'm not showing any fear of God, I'm not showing it doesn't reflect anything. Doing something actively shows my love for God, its inherent value, but refraining from something which I don't have to do anyway, that doesn't show anything. So that's what the Maharal writes. The Avos only took on the positive commandments, not the negative commandments. And therefore they point out, and that's why he explains in different mitzvahs that when we find the Avos violating, when we find them violating negative commandments, not positive. I say an example, there's an interesting shtickle Torah I saw I wanted to know how Yitzchak could eat from the shchita, the slaughtering of Esav. There was a nevela, but Esav was a mummer anyway, and the different halakhic issues with Esav's slaughtering. So how could Yitzchak eat the food? So they talk about the concept of a summa, someone who's blind, whether he's obligated in mitzvahs or not. There's different, we assume basically with mitzvahs that don't have to do with sight, it's basically a blind person is obligated. But the discussion in the Gemara whether a summa is exempt. So one opinion is the summa is exempt from mitzvahs. Some say he's exempt from everything, positive and negative. But others say, what do you mean? Then he's like a guy, then he's like a Gentile, he's not going to keep any mitzvahs. Others say, no, he's only exempt from the mitzvahs aseh, from the positive commandment, but not the negative. So that's how someone to point out, how could Yitzchak eat from the shechita? Didn't he violate the negative commandment of the Vela? The answer is no. As Maharal Miprag says, they didn't take on negative commandments, so there's no problem in the Vela. But there's a mitzvah aseh of shechita. There's a positive mitzvah zavachta ve'achalta, to do a shechita before you eat. So in that, Chazal will tell you, since Yitzchak was a summa and working with the opinion that someone who's blind is patur mi mitzvah aseh, so he's exempt from negative commandments, like the Maharal said. They never kept negative, but they kept positive. But since he was a summa, so therefore working with the opinion that summa is exempt from positive commandments. So to summarize, we have 4 different opinions in terms of 4 different schools of thought in terms of our discussion whether the Avos kept the Torah or not. How much did they keep? Did they keep it all? Some of it? What are some guiding principles we could use when we learn through the book of Bereshit? So we gave 4 explanations. Number 1, the Tshuvas Harama, that only Avram kept the Torah, but not Yitzchak and Yaakov. Logically, perhaps one can make an argument. We said, but that seems to go against the Chazals, which seem to say everyone did. That was the Tshuvas Ramah. That was the difficulty with it, because the Chazal seemed to go against it. Taryag mitzvah shamarti. Then we gave 3 explanations working with all the Avos kept it. But they all had their own limitations. The Ramban's limitation was they only kept the Torah in the land of Israel, not in Chutz La'aretz. That's how Yaakov married 2 sisters. You had the Orach Chaim HaKodesh and the Nefesh HaChaim, that they kept all the mitzvahs as volunteer work. So when they saw in Shamayim that in this specific case it's better to violate it, like the 2 sisters, they realized the 12 tribes are coming out. So therefore, in this scenario, they said it's better, like Lo Mazeh Anochi, if you're not commanded, then you have more flexibility. And you have the 4th explanation, the Maharal Miprag, that the Avos only kept the positive commandments they volunteered, but they did not volunteer the negative commandments.